Good afternoon and welcome to the Fusilier Museum in Bury for an exclusive interview with Michael Elston. We're going to be discussing local issues, national issues and international issues. To start off with, Michael, if elected, what is the first thing you would do?
Good afternoon. Well, when the Bury Times first interviewed me in 2020, they asked me that same question, and I'm going to answer in the same way today. I said that I want to reintroduce bobbies on the beat, and also that I want to employ more nurses in our hospitals. And if we don't employ more nurses in the hospitals in the immediacy after this election, then our hospitals are going to struggle again this coming winter. And I know we're going to be discussing the NHS more shortly. But just to say about bobbies on the beat, I don't advocate bobbies on the beat purely out of some kind of nostalgia. I advocate bobbies on the beat because I think there's great value in it. They get to know the area, they get to know the people who live in the area. And when a crime is committed, they're more likely to know who is and who isn't likely to have committed it. And that saves time, and that's half the job done.
Greater Manchester's Places for Everyone spatial plan has released 2,000 hectares of greenbelt. Do you support it?
I'm completely against building on greenbelt. It simply isn't necessary. There are huge swathes of Greater Manchester that have been neglected for the entirety of my lifetime, and all over the country there are town and city centres that are neglected. They're desperately in need of the development. That's where we should be building more housing, not on the greenbelt.
What do you think of Greater Manchester's new public transport network?
In the immediacy, public transport in Greater Manchester is far too expensive. Geneva offers free public transport for visitors. Montpellier has recently introduced free public transport for residents. In Greater Manchester, a one-day pass for bus, tram and train presently costs £11.20, and that's off-peak. That isn't good enough.
Are you offering to provide free public transport in Greater Manchester?
I would love to offer free public transport in Greater Manchester. What we have to remember is Greater Manchester is far bigger. Well, the population of Greater Manchester is 10 times the size of Montpellier, so it's more challenging. It goes back to what we were discussing before in terms of developing the towns outside Manchester itself. At the moment, a disproportionate number of journeys are going into and out of Manchester city centre. When we've developed the rest of Greater Manchester and we've spread journeys out throughout Greater Manchester, then introducing free public transport becomes more of a reality.
You have been an advocate of saving the National Health Service from privatisation, but what in practice can be done to save it?
The NHS can't be permitted to carry on in its present form, and all I hear from the old political parties is how much or how little funding they're going to give it. It has a lot of problems and it's going to take a lot of time and effort to put them right, but in the immediacy we need to dissect it for the time being, leave what's good and start to rebuild from scratch everything that's going wrong.
Which leads us to our next question, because in September 2020 you first spoke out about involuntary euthanasia in NHS hospitals, the reintroduction of the Liverpool Care Pathway. When you exposed the end-of-life pathway scandal, which is a terrible tragedy, what did you expect to happen and what do you think of the response?
When I first made that speech in September 2020, and then just over 3 years ago I had leaflets distributed throughout Greater Manchester, I expected that would be the end of it. In practice, hardly anyone in a position to do anything did anything. The majority of the public seems to have willfully ignored it, and here we are over 3 years later and there's been no discernible improvement. It's all still happening.
You've stood 3 times in the local elections for the ward of Chorlton in Manchester and lost each time. What do you think of the people of Chorlton?
Well, firstly, I have to say thank you to everyone who's supported me over the years. Thanks to everyone who's displayed my leaflets and who's helped me to distribute leaflets. Thanks to everyone who's displayed my posters and who's helped me put up posters, and to everyone who's voted for me, and everyone who's chatted to me as I've been wandering around and given me positive feedback, and who's told me that they voted for me or that they're planning to vote for me. Thanks to everyone who's liked and shared things on social media. Thanks in particular to everyone who's shared that video of my speech from Altrincham Town Hall. Anyone who's supported me in any way over the last few years, then thank you, I appreciate it. All that said, it has to be said that the overwhelming response from the people of Chorlton since I started standing in the local elections in 2018 has been malicious abuse. Now that malicious abuse has been stirred up by the old political parties, and in Chorlton, the worst of them are the Labour Party and the Green Party. But that said, I haven't seen many people standing up to them. And again, thank you to those people who did have the strength of character to stand up to them. Now, there are over 10,000 people on the electoral register in Chorlton. It may be when I first started standing, they didn't know why I was doing it, but if not before, bearing in mind they've all received numerous leaflets from me over the years, just over 3 years ago, they knew that I was standing for some extremely serious issues. If at that stage the people of Chorlton had got behind me, if they'd all shared that video of my speech from Altrincham Town Hall, well, hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved. And I stood again in the local elections last year and lost. It's a whole year. In that year alone, in Greater Manchester alone, over 1,000 lives could have been saved.
But don't you think it's unfair to blame the public for the government's actions?
I don't think it's unfair because the public has to take responsibility for its actions too. And the people of Chorlton knew what was happening and they had the opportunity to do something about it, but instead they attacked me and they attacked the victims and they voted for the perpetrators, and people died because of it. A massive number of people died and those lives could have been saved. And those people who voted Labour, Liberal Democrat, Green or Conservative, those people are responsible for those deaths.
You've proposed a public inquiry into the safety of the COVID vaccines. Isn't the idea that the vaccines are unsafe merely a conspiracy theory propagated by the anti-vaxxers?
Well, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, I'm a pro-vaxxer, and as it happens, I recently uploaded some footage to a, let's say, a well-known social media video sharing platform, and it was footage of a parliamentary debate about excess deaths. And one of the MPs speaking on the issue was attempting to make the link between the inexplicable recent increase in deaths in this country and in many countries throughout the world with the COVID vaccines. And such was the surety of that video sharing platform, and it informed me such was the surety of the World Health Organization as to the safety of the COVID vaccines, that it was deemed no longer necessary for that footage to be displayed. Footage of a debate in the House of Commons by elected MPs that I had downloaded myself from Parliament's own website. Now, as I said, I'm a pro-vaxxer. I'm in favour of vaccines, providing, of course, they're safe and effective, as we know the COVID vaccines are. And in fact, even if they were entirely ineffective but still safe, I probably wouldn't be unduly perturbed. If purely theoretically there was a situation in which a vaccine was unsafe, or this is a theoretical situation, we're not discussing the COVID vaccines now, so let's say there was a hypothetical situation in which a vaccine was dangerous, then I'm sure you would agree, and anyone would agree, that that would be cause for concern. Of course, we've been repeatedly reassured by the government and the World Health Organization that that's not the case for the COVID vaccines, which we know are safe and effective. Nonetheless, as things stand, rumours are abounding that the COVID vaccines are not entirely safe. And in fact, the idea that there could be a vaccine that's not entirely safe isn't entirely hypothetical, because there have been cases in the past in which vaccines have been withdrawn because they've been dangerous. Now, these rumours are merely conspiracy theories, but I would have thought that such was the certainty of the government and the World Health Organization as to the safety of these vaccines, that they would be eager to have a vaccine inquiry as soon as possible for the purpose of allaying those fears and quelling those rumours. As things stand, everyone who's had the vaccine wants to be reassured that they haven't been damaged by it, and that small number of people who have been injured, because there are a small number of people who have suffered rare adverse reactions, want to know what they should be doing about it. I would have thought that, if nothing more than out of political expediency, the government would be chewing it a bit to have a vaccine inquiry, and yet, inexplicably, the vaccine segment of the COVID inquiry has been delayed for 6 months, or should I say, at least 6 months. Well, if I find myself in a position to do so, I'll be holding a vaccine inquiry as soon as possible.
When you first started discussing putting an end to party politics, the idea that a coalition of independents could win a general election was unthinkable. Can you win this general election with independents? And if you did, would you be Prime Minister?
Well, I'll take the second question first. I suspect that many of the independents standing in this general election don't know who I am and don't realise that this is an idea that emanated from me. So there's no reason to guarantee that they would all vote for me, or indeed, being independents, that any of them would vote for me. I've spent the last 6 years trying to encourage members of the public to stand for election as independents. And apart from a small handful of people, they didn't do it. They wouldn't do it. It's a bit late now. Over 300,000 lives could have been saved in this country in that time. And even now, many of the independents standing, they don't speak out about the serious issues. They revert to behaving like the old political parties. So there's no point having 650 new people who don't do anything different from the 650 people we had before. And likewise, I've spent 6 years attempting to encourage existing independents to work together for the purpose of winning elections. And again, apart from a small handful of people, they wouldn't do it. So what's the point of those people? What are they going to do if they win elections? Are they going to continue to refuse to work with anyone else? Are they going to refuse to help their constituents? They're doing it out of some kind of vain glory. And I'm by no means against the pursuit of honour, but at the moment we have some very serious issues that need confronting, and it would be helpful if they could at least do both. So yes, as you say, this year we have approximately 500 independents and smaller political parties standing in the general election. Thankfully, some marketing people got on board and they've spread it via social media, and some of them are very good. So yes, I'm advocating voting independent, because I think that's the best way to break down this party political system. But actually, I think we've progressed again since then. I think we've now progressed to a point at which we need to rid ourselves of these democratic regimes altogether.
Do you support a second Scottish independence referendum?
There are some independents standing in Scotland, and I know that some of them want another referendum. I can't speak for all the independents, but as far as I'm concerned, if the majority of people in Scotland want a second referendum, with it coming up to 10 years since the first one, I would vote in favour of having another referendum, but I'll be campaigning for Scotland to remain. I'm very patriotic, and my patriotism is inclusive of Scotland. That said, in a way, I would like to see an independent Scotland in much the same way as I would like to see an independent Greater Manchester, not independent from the rest of the nation, but independent from the old political parties, independent from the Conservative Party, independent from the Labour Party, independent from the Liberal Democrats, independent from the Greens, and in the case of Scotland, independent from the SNP.
Do you support the two-state solution for the purpose of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, before I answer that question, let me raise an issue which relates to my answer. And the issue is that over the last few years, I think more and more people have started thinking that we should be questioning every aspect of how we live our lives. And in fact, that's something we should be doing all the time. And that includes confronting some unpalatable truths. And one of those unpalatable truths is that the vast majority of people in this country and in the world at large are brainwashed. And brainwashing comes in lots of guises, but in this case I'm talking about being brainwashed by religious belief and by political ideology. And in fact, even that's not quite right, because something else is going on. It isn't the religion or the political ideology that's brainwashing people. It's a sense of tribalism, of peer pressure into conforming to the same way of thinking as everyone else in that group thinks. And so, in answer to your question, what we first have to ask ourselves is, and I'm asking this to everyone who's watching, do you really want to end the war? Or, truth be told, do you want to kill people? Do you want to kill people who are not in your tribe? And if you think about it, the right answer is that you should want to end the war. And I want to end the war. So, in answer to your question, no, because I don't think an independent Palestinian state would help end that conflict. I think it would be deleterious to the prospect of peace in that region. If we're talking about Gaza being an independent state, I don't think that's what most Palestinian people want. And what would happen if Gaza became an independent state? If that solved this problem, then absolutely I would support it. I think that if there was an independent Palestinian state, Iran would flood it with weapons and there'd be all-out war within that region instantly, which admittedly may well happen anyway. So this is a conflict that's gone on for a long time. It's a particularly bitter conflict. It's not going to end overnight, but it just takes a generation. So what we now have to start thinking about is, well, what do we want that region of the world to look like in a generation's time? And how are we going to make that a reality? Well, when I was in Ukraine 2 years ago, I spoke about the potential of building international cities in places of conflict for the purpose of averting future wars. And that's an idea that's now gathering some momentum, and it's had an impact on the recent American peace proposal for Gaza. They mentioned rebuilding Gaza. I think we need to invite people, and this goes back to both the 1948 war, when Palestinian people lost their homes, and now again Palestinian people have lost their homes. I think we should invite people into new homes. We should build new homes in Israel and invite those people who lost their homes to live there. And it goes right back to what we were talking about the green belt. Why do developers want to build on Greenbelt because it's easy and it's profitable, and sadly that's the way the world works. We need to provide an alternative that's profitable. Well, building new towns and cities is profitable. If we're going to be giving homes away, all right, it's not quite as profitable, but if it's going to be saving lives, then it's an alternative possibility. That's what I would like to see happen.
Are you sceptical of our current system of democracy?
I'm completely against democracy. And just to clarify that point for the banderlog of Labour, Green, Liberal Democrat, Conservative, Reform adherents who may be watching this, when I say I'm against democracy, I don't mean that I want to revert to tyranny, but rather that I want to make progress towards having more rights and freedoms, towards having the right and freedom to make decisions about ourselves for ourselves.
Isn't that what democracy is?
No. Democracy is the power of one group of people, a bigger group of people, over a smaller group or smaller groups or individuals. And so what tends to happen is the bigger group exploits everyone else. And of course, no one wants to be in the smaller group. So they all team up until they're the bigger group, and then they exploit everyone else. And what we're seeing in the world at large at the moment, this is ultimately how democracy ends. The entire world divided into massive conglomerations of nations, each with a mega army at its disposal. And I, for one, don't think that's a good thing.
This country as a nuclear deterrent. Would you ever use it?
I hear this term nuclear deterrent used all the time. We've had nuclear weapons since the 1940s. We've had Trident since 1980. And you're absolutely right, it's called a nuclear deterrent. Well, for the most part, I don't support the use of deterrents. As you know, I'm against fines. Using deterrents isn't a good way of teaching children. It isn't a decent way to treat anyone, and it certainly shouldn't be how we're conducting international relations. As far as I'm concerned, we don't have nuclear weapons as a deterrent. We have nuclear weapons in case we need to use them. And I very much hope that we never need to use them.
The country is in a mess. The entire world is divided. Is this the time for a great leader to step out of the shadows and take responsibility? Are you that great leader, Michael?
Well, I hope I'm not anyone's leader, because we're not a pack of animals, we're human beings, and I think it's about time we start to behave like it. So if anything, my intention isn't to lead the biggest tribe, but rather my intention, if anything, is to lead people into thinking for themselves.
And that concludes our exclusive interview with Michael Elston.
Thank you. Let's hope it's not quite as exclusive as usual.